Part 1. Hey guys, tonight we leave behind blazing battlefields, roaring dragons, and very enthusiastic Viking raids to spend an evening somewhere much quieter. Tonight, you'll settle into the warm glow of a Viking longhouse during the deepest part of winter, where snow drifts against timber walls, the fire crackles softly in the hearth, and families gather around simple meals designed to carry them through the long Nordic darkness. You'll discover what Vikings actually ate during those endless winter nights: preserved fish, smoked meats, hearty stews, coarse barley bread, dairy products, and surprisingly practical vegetables that rarely appear in Hollywood movies. Because, as it turns out, surviving a Scandinavian winter requires significantly more cabbage than axes. So before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these relaxing journeys through history. And while you're getting comfortable, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe grab a blanket, and let's step quietly into the snowy world of Viking-age Scandinavia. The wind arrives first. It always does. A low moaning sound rolling across the frozen landscape long before you see the village itself. Snow stretches across the countryside in every direction, reflecting pale moonlight beneath a sky crowded with stars. The fjord nearby has begun forming thin sheets of ice along its edges, while dark pine forests stand silent beneath heavy blankets of snow. Winter owns the land now. The growing season ended months ago. The sea grows rougher, the days have become painfully short, and the nights seem endless. Honestly, modern people complain when grocery stores close for a holiday weekend. The Vikings occasionally faced 6 months of carefully rationing everything that stood between them and starvation. Ahead, warm orange light glows through narrow openings in a large timber structure, a longhouse. The center of daily life throughout much of Viking Scandinavia. You move closer through the snow. The smell reaches you before the doorway does. Wood smoke, cooking broth, fresh bread, animal hides drying near the fire. Inside, warmth immediately surrounds you. The longhouse stretches farther than expected, supported by massive wooden beams darkened by years of smoke rising toward the roof. A long central hearth burns steadily through the middle of the room. Its fire rarely goes out during winter. People sit along wooden benches wrapped in wool cloaks, while children sleep beneath blankets of fur near the warmest parts of the house. The atmosphere feels calm, safe, protected from the frozen darkness outside. Near the hearth, a large iron pot hangs above glowing coals. Something is cooking, slowly, patiently. The Viking approach to winter food begins long before winter itself arrives. Every meal you're about to encounter represents months of planning, months of preserving, months of preparing for the season when fresh food becomes scarce. Because Viking farmers understand something deeply important: summer feeds winter. Historians are still debating the exact regional variations in Viking diets across Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, and settlements farther abroad, but archaeological evidence consistently reveals one theme: preparation. Without preservation, survival becomes impossible. One woman kneels beside a wooden storage chest and removes carefully wrapped loaves of barley bread baked earlier that week. The bread appears dense, heavy, practical, not the soft, fluffy loaves many modern people expect. Viking bread exists primarily to keep people alive. Flavor comes second. Though after several hours hauling firewood through snow, even coarse barley bread probably tastes magnificent. Nearby, an older man checks a rack suspended above the hearth where strips of meat hang slowly drying in the warm, smoky air. Preservation never truly stops here, even during winter. The fire crackles softly. Snow taps gently against the roof. And throughout the longhouse, people prepare the evening meal, while darkness settles fully across the frozen world outside. You take a place near the hearth. The warmth feels wonderful after the cold. The stew simmers. The bread waits beside the fire. And deep within the sheltering glow of a Viking longhouse during one of the long winter nights of the North, your journey into the foods that sustained an entire civilization is just beginning. Part 2. The fire burns steadily through the center of the longhouse while snow continues falling outside. Its gentle crackling fills the spaces between conversations, mixing with the occasional creak of timber beams settling against the cold. The warmth feels wonderful, but everyone here understands something important. This warmth is expensive. Not in money, in preparation. Everything about surviving a Viking winter depends on planning months ahead. Honestly, modern refrigerators have spoiled humanity beyond measure. The Vikings somehow looked at an approaching 6-month winter and responded, let's preserve absolutely everything. And surprisingly often, it worked. Near the far wall of Longhouse stand several large wooden storage chests bound with iron bands. Clay jars line shelves above them, while sacks made from woven wool and animal hide rest carefully stacked in dry corners. These are not simply containers. They are survival. You move closer while one of the household elders lifts the lid from a storage chest. Inside lies grain, barley mostly, some oats, a little rye, enough to provide bread, porridge, and flour throughout much of the winter season. Grain becomes one of the most important foundations of Viking life. Not glamorous, not heroic, but absolutely essential. Archaeologists frequently discover evidence of barley cultivation across Viking settlements. It thrives better than many other crops in the challenging climates of Scandinavia and becomes a dietary cornerstone for centuries. The Vikings may celebrate warriors in their stories, but farmers feed the warriors. A lesson history repeats endlessly. One young woman carries a wooden bucket toward a hand mill positioned near the hearth. She pours grain into the upper stone and begins turning it steadily. Slow work, patient work. The rhythmic grinding joins the sounds of the fire, round and round, stone against stone, transforming stored grain into fresh flour. Nearby, another family member mixes some of that flour with water and a small amount of sourdough starter preserved from previous baking. Nothing is wasted. Everything continues. The cycle stretches across seasons. Summer grows grain, autumn stores grain, winter consumes grain. Spring begins again, at least, hopefully. Historians are still debating exactly how varied grain consumption becomes across different Viking communities, especially between inland farmers and coastal settlements with stronger access to fishing resources. But grain remains valuable almost everywhere. You notice another storage container being opened. This one contains dried peas, hard as pebbles now, yet capable of lasting months when stored properly. Beside them sit beans, dried herbs, and carefully preserved root vegetables gathered during the autumn harvest. None look particularly exciting, but excitement is not the objective. Survival is. A middle-aged woman removes several onions from a woven basket hanging near the roof beams. The onions have lasted surprisingly well. So have turnips, and cabbages stored in cool, dry spaces throughout the settlement. Many people imagine Viking meals consisting entirely of meat. Reality proves far more practical. Vegetables matter enormously, especially during winter. Without them, nutritional problems become increasingly dangerous. One elderly man sitting near the fire laughs softly while carving a wooden spoon. Apparently, a child has just asked why they cannot simply eat smoked pork every day. The adults seem highly entertained by this suggestion, because somewhere between food preservation, seasonal shortages, and livestock management, reality tends to interfere with childhood meal planning. The stew hanging over the hearth continues simmering. The smell grows richer now. Onions, herbs, a little meat, root vegetables slowly softening in the broth. The entire longhouse smells comforting, warm, hearty, safe. Outside, winter presses against the walls. Inside, preparation pushes back. You glance upward toward the rafters where bundles of dried herbs hang suspended from wooden beams. Thyme, angelica, wild herbs gathered during warmer months and saved carefully for winter cooking. Even flavor must be preserved. Nothing fresh grows now beneath the snow. Every ingredient tells a story about earlier seasons, a story of foresight, of effort, of understanding exactly what the coming darkness will require. The grinding stone continues turning steadily. Bread dough rises slowly near the fire. Storage chests remain filled with the results of months of labor. And inside the warm, golden glow of the Viking longhouse, while the storm gathers strength beyond the timber walls and snow drifts quietly across the frozen landscape, the carefully built food reserves of an entire household wait patiently to carry everyone through another long northern winter night. Part 3. The storage chests are closed once again. The grain has been measured, the vegetables selected, the herbs gathered from their hanging bundles near the rafters. Now the attention of the longhouse turns towards something far more immediate: bread. Not the soft bakery loaves many people imagine today. not warm sandwich bread, certainly not anything topped with avocado. Viking bread is a practical companion designed to survive difficult lives and long winters. And tonight, as snow piles against the walls outside, its familiar smell begins spreading through the longhouse. Near the hearth, the dough prepared earlier rests in broad wooden bowls beside the fire. It rises slowly in the warmth, not dramatically, just enough. The woman tending it presses a finger lightly into the surface before nodding with satisfaction. Time to bake. Bread forms one of the most dependable foods in Viking households. Barley remains the most common grain across much of Scandinavia, although rye and oats also appear depending on region and harvest conditions. The resulting loaves tend to be dense, hearty, filling, designed to satisfy hunger after long days of labor. Historians are still debating exactly how different Viking bread recipes varied between regions and social classes, but archaeological discoveries consistently reveal grain processing as an essential part of daily life. Bread appears everywhere, in settlements, trading towns, farms, even remote northern communities. A young boy helps carry flat stones heated beside the hearth. These stones serve as simple baking surfaces. Elsewhere, some households use iron griddles or clay ovens, but many breads remain relatively simple. Practical solutions for practical lives. The dough is shaped carefully into round, flat loaves. Nothing fancy, no decorative patterns, no elaborate scoring, just food. Reliable food, the sort of food that allows people to survive until spring. Honestly, entire civilizations are often built less on grand battles and more on somebody successfully baking enough bread. One loaf after another is placed onto heated surfaces near the fire. The smell begins almost immediately. Warm grain, wood smoke, fresh baking. The aroma spreads through the longhouse with remarkable speed. Even the children notice. Several suddenly appear suspiciously interested in helping with kitchen tasks, a timeless human behavior. Nearby, an older woman prepares another staple of Viking winter life. Porridge. Simple, efficient, nutritious. Ground grain mixed with water or milk and cooked slowly over the fire. Some versions include dried berries saved from summer gathering. Others use nuts or honey when available. The ingredients vary. The principle remains the same. Use what you have. Waste nothing. A wooden spoon stirs steadily through a heavy iron pot while steam rises into the smoky air above. The firelight dances across the surface. Outside, wind rattles the roof. Inside, the meal continues taking shape. The first loaf emerges from the baking stone. Dark brown, slightly uneven, beautiful, at least by winter standards. A knife cuts through the crust with a satisfying crack. Steam escapes immediately. Several people glance over. Even adults struggle to ignore fresh bread. The loaf is passed carefully around the room. Each person receives a portion. Nothing extravagant, just enough. Enough matters. You take a piece yourself. The texture feels coarse compared to modern bread. Denser, heavier, rich with grain flavor. The sort of bread that asks to be chewed thoughtfully. The sort of bread that remains filling long after the meal ends. One older man sitting near the hearth smiles faintly while eating. He explains that bread tastes best during storms. Nobody argues. Outside, the weather continues worsening. Snow swirls around the longhouse beneath the darkness. The wind howls softly through gaps between buildings in the village. Yet inside, fresh bread and warm porridge create their own kind of shelter. Food becomes more than nutrition during winter. It becomes reassurance, evidence that preparation succeeded, proof that the household remains safe, for now. A basket of dried apples appears from another storage shelf. Not many remain. These are treated carefully, small pieces shared among family members, a taste of autumn preserved through the darkest season. The children seem delighted, the adults perhaps even more so. Memory often travels through food. One bite can recall warmer months, green fields, long daylight, harvest season, things currently hidden beneath snow. The bread basket empties slowly. More loaves continue baking beside the hearth. The porridge thickens. Conversations drift quietly through the longhouse. Stories, jokes, plans for tomorrow. Nothing urgent, nothing dramatic. Just ordinary people sharing an ordinary meal during an extraordinary season. And deep within the warm glow of the Viking longhouse, while fresh barley bread cools beside the fire, and winter storms wander across the frozen Scandinavian night beyond the walls, the simple foods that sustain an entire community continue bringing comfort one loaf at a time. Part 4. The last crumbs of fresh barley bread disappear slowly from wooden plates while the storm continues outside. Snow rattles against the timber walls of the longhouse. The wind pushes through the darkness beyond the village, swirling around fences, sheds, and frozen fields buried beneath layers of white. Inside, however, the fire remains steady, warm, dependable, the heart of the house. And above that heart hangs one of the most valuable food supplies a Viking family can possess during winter: smoked meat. Honestly, if Viking households had social media, half the photographs would probably feature things hanging from ceiling beams. Above your head, dozens of dark strips sway gently in the rising heat from the hearth. Pork, mutton, goat, occasionally beef. Months earlier, these animals provided fresh meat during autumn slaughtering season. Now they provide survival. The smoke from the central fire curls upward toward the roof, surrounding the hanging meat day after day, week after week. The process removes moisture while helping preserve the food against spoilage. Simple, effective, essential. A middle-aged farmer rises from his bench and reaches upward with a hooked pole. One long strip of smoked pork comes down from the rafters. The meat appears dark and firm after weeks of curing and smoking. Nothing about it resembles modern supermarket cuts. This is food prepared for endurance, food prepared for winter. Historians are still debating exact preservation techniques used across different Viking settlements, but archaeological evidence consistently reveals smoking, drying, salting, and fermenting as critical strategies throughout Scandinavia. Without preservation, winter becomes dangerous. With preservation, communities endure. The farmer slices the pork carefully into thin pieces using a well-worn knife. The meat is too valuable to waste. Every cut matters. Each portion stretches limited resources farther. The slices are added directly into the simmering stew hanging above the hearth. Immediately, the smell changes. Richer now, deeper. The smoky aroma spreads through the room. Children look interested again, a recurring pattern this evening. Near the opposite wall, another family member checks a storage barrel partially buried beneath packed earth flooring. Inside lies salted meat preserved months earlier. Salt remains enormously valuable throughout Viking society, imported in some regions, carefully managed in others. When available, it dramatically extends food storage possibilities. The barrel is opened briefly before being sealed again. No need to use everything tonight. Winter has many weeks remaining, possibly many months. A lesson Viking households learn early: never eat as though spring arrives tomorrow, because sometimes it doesn't. You notice several cured sausages hanging beside the smoked cuts, simple mixtures of meat, fat, herbs, and spices when available. Compact, portable, long-lasting. The Vikings understand efficiency. Their food often reflects that understanding. One elderly woman sitting near the fire recalls a winter many years ago when storms delayed fishing boats for weeks. The preserved meat hanging above the hearth became the difference between comfort and hardship. The younger listeners pay close attention. These stories matter. Food knowledge passes through generations, just like myths and traditions. Not everything valuable appears in sagas. Sometimes wisdom sounds like instructions for preserving pork correctly. A nearby child asks why the meat cannot simply stay fresh forever. Several adults laugh quietly. A fair question. One that humanity spends thousands of years attempting to solve before eventually inventing refrigeration. The answer involves a lengthy explanation about moisture, spoilage, and patience. The child appears unconvinced. The stew continues simmering. Chunks of smoked pork soften gradually in the broth. The smell grows wonderful. Wood smoke, meat, herbs, onions, warmth itself. Outside, darkness presses harder against the village. The storm shows no sign of ending. Snow drifts higher along the walls. The fjord remains hidden beneath blowing white mist. Yet inside the longhouse, food prepared months earlier continues feeding the present. Summer and autumn reach forward through time, a remarkable achievement when you think about it. One household member climbs onto a bench and adjusts several hanging cuts near the warmest part of the smoke path. Even now, preservation continues. Winter is not a pause, only another stage in the cycle. Prepare, store, use carefully, prepare again. The fire crackles. The meat softens inside the stew. Stories drift through the warm room while shadows dance along the beams overhead. And deep within the sheltering glow of the Viking longhouse, while smoked meats hang patiently above generations gathered around the hearth, and winter storms roam across the frozen Scandinavian landscape beyond the walls. The careful art of preserving food continues sustaining life through another long northern night. Haber Part 5. The stew grows richer with every passing minute. Above the central hearth, the heavy iron pot bubbles softly while curls of steam rise into the smoky air of the longhouse. The pieces of smoked pork have begun releasing their flavor into the broth, turning what was once a simple vegetable soup into something far heartier. Outside, the storm continues. Inside, dinner slowly becomes magnificent, at least by Viking winter standards. Honestly, after months of darkness and freezing temperatures, almost anything hot begins feeling like a luxury. The smell filling the longhouse now comes from another essential winter food source: fish, specifically preserved fish. Because if there is one thing Scandinavia has never lacked, it is access to water. The sea feeds the Vikings almost as reliably as the fields. Near one end of the longhouse, a wooden rack holds several bundles wrapped in cloth and animal hide. An older fisherman carefully unties one of them and reveals rows of dried fish stored for winter use. The fish look remarkably plain, hard, thin, almost wooden, yet appearances can be deceiving. These simple preserved catches help sustain entire communities through the cold season. Cod, herring, and other northern fish become crucial resources across Viking-age Scandinavia. When properly dried in cold coastal air, fish can last for months without spoiling, sometimes much longer. Historians are still debating the exact scale of dried fish production during different periods of the Viking Age, but archaeological evidence suggests preserved fish become an increasingly important trade and survival commodity throughout the North Atlantic world. One fisherman holds up a dried cod. The fish appears almost impossibly stiff. A nearby child taps it experimentally and seems delighted by the sound. Several adults try not to laugh. The fish is eventually broken into smaller pieces and soaked in warm water near the hearth. Patience is required. Many Viking foods demand patience. The dried flesh slowly softens while the household continues preparing the evening meal. Nearby, another family member opens a barrel filled with salted herring. The smell arrives immediately, powerfully, enthusiastically. Salted fish rarely enters history as a glamorous culinary experience, yet it remains one of the most valuable foods available during winter. Nutrition matters more than elegance. The Vikings understand this perfectly. Several pieces of softened fish are added to a smaller cooking pot along with onions and herbs gathered during summer. A second stew begins taking shape beside the first. The room smells wonderful. Wood smoke, fish broth, pork stew, fresh bread. A combination capable of convincing almost anyone that winter is survivable. One elderly fisherman settles near the fire and begins telling stories while waiting for the fish to cook. Naturally, every story becomes larger with each retelling. The cod become bigger, the storms become stronger, the boats become smaller. A universal tradition among fishermen throughout human history, the younger listeners remain fascinated anyway. Outside, the wind howls across the fjord. Inside, the fisherman describes a catch so enormous that it supposedly required 3 men and a deeply questionable amount of optimism to haul aboard. No one appears entirely convinced. The stew bubbles quietly. The fire crackles. The story continues growing. A woman seated nearby prepares several dried herbs to add flavor to the fish broth. Winter cooking often relies heavily on preserved ingredients. Fresh vegetables become scarce. Fresh herbs disappear beneath snow. Everything available now reflects decisions made months ago. Every meal is a conversation between seasons. Summer sends ingredients. Winter receives them. You watch as the fish slowly transforms in the pot. What began as hard preserved food becomes tender again, useful again, comforting again. A remarkable process, especially when one remembers that these fish may have been caught during entirely different weather, different months, perhaps even different seasons. The Vikings excel at extending time through preservation. They must. The northern climate demands it. One child finally receives a small piece of cooked fish and immediately declares it far superior to dried fish. The adults agree, though privately they are grateful for both. The storm outside grows stronger. Snow piles higher against the walls. Darkness stretches endlessly across the frozen landscape. Yet the longhouse remains bright, warm, filled with food, filled with stories. filled with people who planned carefully enough to face another winter night without fear. The fish stew thickens. The pork stew simmers beside it. The fire glows warmly through the center of the room, and deep within the sheltering timber walls of the Viking longhouse, while preserved fish from distant summer waters returns to life inside steaming pots and snowstorms sweep across the frozen fjords beyond, the sea continues feeding the north even in the darkest season of the year. Part 6. The fish stew simmers gently beside the larger pot of pork and vegetables. The smells mingle together above the hearth, creating a warm cloud of comfort that fills every corner of the longhouse. Outside, winter continues its relentless work. Snow piles higher against fences. Ice thickens along the fjord. The darkness beyond the walls feels endless. But here, gathered around the fire, nobody seems particularly concerned. Dinner is nearly ready. And dinner, during a Viking winter, is serious business. Honestly, if you spend 6 hours gathering firewood in sub-zero temperatures, almost any hot meal starts feeling like a feast. A woman standing near the hearth removes the lid from a smaller cooking pot. Steam rushes upward immediately. Inside is one of the most common and comforting foods found throughout the Viking world. A hearty stew. Not a fancy stew. Not a recipe destined for royal cookbooks. Just a practical mixture of whatever ingredients happen to be available. And yet, somehow, it smells incredible. The Vikings excel at turning necessity into nourishment. The stew contains onions, turnips, cabbage, herbs, smoked pork, and softened fish broth prepared earlier in the evening. Every ingredient serves a purpose. Every ingredient provides calories, nutrients, or flavor needed to survive the season. Historians are still debating the exact combinations used in Viking cooking, since recipes rarely survive in written form, but archaeological evidence from cooking vessels, food remains, and settlement sites strongly suggests that stews become a central feature of daily meals. For good reason. Stews are efficient. They stretch limited supplies, they soften preserved foods, and they keep people warm, a combination difficult to improve upon. One young boy stares hopefully into the pot, while an older woman stirs slowly with a long wooden spoon. The stew thickens gradually, the broth darkens, the smell becomes almost impossible to ignore. Several adults suddenly find reasons to wander closer to the hearth. Pure coincidence, of course. Nearby, a wooden table has begun filling with bowls carved from birch and oak. Nothing matches exactly. Most have been made by hand. Each carries small imperfections earned through years of use. A family does not need perfect bowls. A family needs bowls that survive winter. The first portions are served carefully. No one rushes. The meal must stretch across everyone gathered in the house. Each bowl receives broth, vegetables, and small portions of meat, enough to satisfy, enough to restore energy, enough to remind people why preparation matters. The steam curls upward into the smoky rafters. People cradle the bowls in both hands, warming fingers chilled from earlier work outdoors. For a moment, nobody talks. Eating takes priority. A wise cultural decision. One elderly farmer tastes the stew and nods approvingly. Apparently, this is high praise. The cook accepts it with visible satisfaction. Several children begin eating enthusiastically enough to suggest they may not have appreciated the months of preservation required to create this meal. A common challenge across generations. The adults understand. Every bite represents work completed months earlier. Fields planted, fish caught, animals raised, herbs gathered, food stored. Nothing arrived easily. The Vikings lived close to the realities of food production. Very close. A nearby grandmother quietly explains how different households make slightly different versions of winter stew depending on region, harvest conditions, and family traditions. Some add more fish. Others rely more heavily on dairy. Some use dried peas. Others prefer cabbage. Every village develops its own habits. Every family develops its own recipes. The firelight dances across the wooden walls while conversation gradually returns around the room. People discuss weather, upcoming repairs, fishing conditions once the storms eventually calm, the sort of practical discussions that keep communities functioning. Nothing dramatic, nothing heroic, just life. The stew continues disappearing from bowls. Second servings appear for those who worked hardest during the day. Children begin slowing down. Warm food has that effect. The combination of heat, full stomachs, and crackling fire gradually softens everyone's energy. Outside, the storm remains fierce. Inside, comfort wins. For tonight, a young girl dips a piece of barley bread into her stew and announces that this is the best meal of the winter. The adults smile. They have heard similar declarations after nearly every successful dinner. Still, nobody argues, because at this exact moment, with snow swirling beyond the walls and warmth filling the longhouse, she may very well be right. The bowls slowly empty, the fire continues glowing, the wind sings softly around the roof beams, and deep within the warm heart of the Viking longhouse, while steaming stew nourishes tired families gathered around the hearth and winter storms roam the frozen Scandinavian wilderness outside, one of humanity's oldest comforts can use working its quiet magic. A hot meal shared together on a cold night. Part 7. The bowls gradually empty. The last curls of steam drift upward from the stew while people lean back against wooden benches, pleasantly warm and noticeably less concerned about the storm raging outside. Dinner has done its job, not merely feeding the body, calming the mind. The fire crackles softly through the center of the longhouse while snow continues piling against the walls beyond. The cold remains out there, the warmth remains in here. For tonight, that is enough. Honestly, one of humanity's greatest inventions may simply be sitting near a fire after eating something hot. The evening settles into a slower rhythm now. Children grow sleepy, conversations soften, and attention gradually turns toward another important part of the Viking winter diet. Dairy, not the dramatic kind that inspires songs and sagas, the dependable kind that quietly keeps people alive. Near the rear of the longhouse, several wooden containers sit carefully arranged along a cool section of wall away from the heat of the hearth. Inside them are some of the most valuable foods available during winter. Butter, cheese, cultured milk products, simple treasures created months earlier when cows, goats, and sheep still grazed on green summer pastures. A woman lifts the lid from a storage crock and reveals several rounds of hard cheese wrapped carefully in cloth. The cheese smells rich, sharp, slightly earthy, exactly the sort of food designed to survive long storage. Throughout much of Scandinavia, dairy products become essential sources of nutrition. Fresh milk cannot last long, especially without refrigeration. But cheese, butter, and fermented dairy can endure for months when properly prepared. The Vikings understand preservation in all its forms, not just meat and fish, milk too. Historians are still debating the precise role dairy plays across different Viking settlements, but archaeological evidence consistently points towards significant consumption of milk products throughout much of the Norse world. One elderly woman slices small portions from a cheese wheel using a knife worn smooth by years of use. The pieces are passed around carefully. No one takes too much. Good cheese in winter is not something to waste. You accept a piece yourself. The texture feels firm, the flavor strong, a little salty, perfect beside the coarse barley bread remaining from dinner. Nearby, another container reveals something closer to cultured milk, a thick fermented dairy product with a tangy flavor somewhat resembling modern skyr. Though the exact relationship between Viking-era dairy foods and modern Scandinavian products remains a subject of ongoing historical discussion. Whatever the precise name, the result is nutritious, filling, and capable of lasting far longer than fresh milk. A young boy wrinkles his nose after tasting it. Several adults laugh. The reaction appears familiar. Apparently, Viking children also have strong opinions about fermented foods. Some things never change. A wooden bowl filled with butter passes from hand to hand around the longhouse. Golden, rich, carefully stored since autumn. A thin layer spread across fresh bread transforms an ordinary meal into something special. The children seem particularly enthusiastic about this development. One girl examines the butter with the concentration usually reserved for royal treasures. Honestly, she may not be wrong. Winter changes how people value food. Things taken for granted during summer become precious during darkness. A farmer seated near the fire explains how dairy often serves as insurance against difficult years. If harvests suffer, if fishing becomes poor, if storms arrive early, livestock and dairy products can help bridge the gap. Nothing guarantees survival, but preparation improves the odds. The Vikings rarely gamble with winter. Outside, the wind rattles the roof once again. A fresh wave of snow sweeps across the village. The darkness beyond the windows remains complete. Yet inside the longhouse, cheese, butter, and fermented milk tell stories of warmer months. Green fields, grazing animals, long summer evenings, memories preserved in edible form. One elderly shepherd quietly recalls a summer decades earlier when abundant pasture produced enough milk to fill storage rooms with cheese for 2 consecutive winters. The younger listeners seem impressed. The older listeners seem skeptical. Perhaps the memory has improved slightly with age, a common historical phenomenon. The fire burns steadily. The dairy bowls circulate through the room. The last traces of stew disappear. People settle deeper into benches and furs while the evening grows older. And deep within the warm shelter of the Viking longhouse, while carefully preserved dairy products from distant summer pastures nourish families gathered around the hearth, and winter storms continue their endless dance across the frozen Scandinavian landscape outside, the quiet abundance of preparation continues, turning hardship into comfort, one meal at a time. Part 8. The evening settles deeper around the longhouse. Dinner has ended. The bowls have been cleared. The cheese and butter have made their rounds. Outside, the snowstorm continues its endless conversation with the wind. Inside, however, another chapter of the Viking winter meal quietly reveals itself. The vegetables, not exactly the stars of popular Viking movies. No one has ever shouted dramatically for glory in turnips. And yet, without them, many Viking communities would have faced a far more difficult winter. Near one wall of the longhouse stands a storage pit covered with wooden planks and insulated with straw. A household member carefully removes the cover. Cool air rises from within. Beneath the planks rests a collection of root vegetables gathered months earlier during autumn. Turnips, carrots, parsnips, onions, cabbages. Simple foods, remarkably important foods. Throughout much of Scandinavia, root vegetables become essential winter staples because they store exceptionally well. Properly protected from moisture and severe freezing, they can remain usable for months, which is fortunate because fresh tomatoes will not be arriving anytime soon. The Vikings work with what the land provides, and the northern land provides roots. Lots of roots. A young girl helps carry several turnips toward the hearth where an older woman begins slicing them into thin pieces for tomorrow's meals. Nothing happens accidentally here. Even while eating tonight's dinner, people prepare for tomorrow's. Winter rewards foresight. Historians are still debating exactly how varied Viking vegetable cultivation becomes across different regions, but archaeological excavations consistently uncover evidence of cabbage, onions, peas, beans, and root crops throughout Norse settlements. The stereotype of Vikings surviving entirely on meat simply does not hold up. Vegetables matter. Quite a lot. One elderly farmer lifts a cabbage from storage and examines it with obvious satisfaction. The cabbage has survived remarkably well. Its outer leaves appear worn and slightly wilted, but the inner layers remain fresh enough for cooking. A small victory against winter, and winter offers few victories cheaply. Nearby, a pot of leftover broth from dinner remains near the fire. Several chopped vegetables are added for tomorrow's stew. The process never truly stops. Meals become ingredients for future meals. Resources cycle continuously through the household. Waste remains the enemy. A middle-aged woman explains how different families maintain slightly different storage methods. Some use root cellars. Others rely on insulated pits. Some hang onions from rafters. Others preserve vegetables through drying or fermentation. Every settlement develops techniques suited to local conditions. Knowledge becomes as valuable as food itself. Outside, the wind slams against the longhouse walls. Snow swirls through the darkness. The storm sounds fierce, yet the vegetables resting safely in storage represent a kind of quiet triumph. Months earlier, someone planted seeds. Someone weeded fields. Someone harvested crops. Someone stored them carefully. And now, in the deepest part of winter, those efforts continue feeding the household. One young boy examines a particularly large turnip and asks whether it qualifies as a legendary turnip. Several adults appear uncertain how to answer. A lively discussion follows. The turnip seems pleased by the attention. The firelight dances across hanging herbs and wooden beams overhead while preparations continue. A basket of dried peas appears from another shelf. Hard now, almost stone-like, but tomorrow they will soften in broth and become nourishment once again. The Vikings possess a remarkable talent for looking at ordinary ingredients and seeing future meals. Perhaps necessity teaches that skill. A grandmother seated near the hearth recalls winters when vegetable stores ran dangerously low before spring. The room grows quieter while she speaks. Everyone understands the seriousness of such memories. Food security is never guaranteed. Preparation helps. Luck helps too. The best households hope for both. The storm continues outside. The storage pit is covered again. The vegetables return to their cool shelter beneath straw and timber. Tomorrow they will become soup, or stew, or porridge, or something equally practical. And deep within the warm glow of the Viking longhouse, while carefully stored vegetables wait patiently beneath wooden covers, and winter storms sweep endlessly across the frozen Scandinavian countryside beyond the walls, the humble roots and cabbages of autumn continue proving that survival often depends not upon grand heroes, but upon very dependable vegetables. Part 9. The storage pit is covered once more. The turnips return to their quiet winter duties. The cabbage resumes being remarkably important, and life inside the longhouse settles into the comfortable rhythm that follows a good meal. The storm outside continues roaring across the countryside, but within these timber walls, surrounded by family firelight and carefully stored food, the world feels smaller, safer, warmer. Honestly, humanity has spent thousands of years discovering that eating together near a fire solves more problems than expected. The children have grown noticeably quieter now. Some sit wrapped in wool blankets near the hearth. Others lean sleepily against parents and grandparents while listening to the conversations drifting through the room. The evening meal may be over, but the evening itself continues. And for many Viking families, this becomes one of the most important parts of winter life, simply being together. Near the center of the longhouse, several wooden boards are placed across low supports to create a communal eating table. Not elaborate, not polished, just practical. The sort of table that has witnessed countless meals, arguments, celebrations, and stories over the years. Tonight, bowls of leftover bread, cheese, and preserved foods remain available for anyone still hungry. A few people continue nibbling quietly while conversation flows around the room. The fire casts golden light across faces weathered by farming, fishing, sailing, and long northern winters. One elderly fisherman begins repairing a net while talking. A farmer sharpens a tool handle. A woman spins wool beside the hearth. Winter evenings rarely mean inactivity. Hands remain busy, even while resting. Historians are still debating exactly how daily family life varied across different Viking communities, but archaeological evidence and later Norse traditions strongly suggest that long winter nights often become important opportunities for household activities, storytelling, craftsmanship, and social bonding. The darkness outside encourages life indoors, and indoors, community matters. A young girl climbs onto a bench beside her grandmother and asks what people ate during winters before the current generation. The grandmother laughs softly. Mostly the same things, she says. A surprisingly common answer throughout history. People often imagine the past changing dramatically from century to century, yet many Viking meals remain familiar across generations. Bread, fish, dairy, vegetables, stew, repeat as necessary. One young boy proudly announces that if he were in charge, every meal would include honey cakes. The adults agree this would create serious logistical challenges. The boy remains unconvinced. A basket of dried apples appears once more and is passed carefully around the room. Only a few pieces remain. These final fruits of autumn receive special appreciation. The sweet flavor stands out sharply against the hearty winter foods consumed throughout the evening. For a moment, everyone remembers warmer days. Harvest season, long sunlight, green fields, summer preserved in tiny bites. The storm rattles the roof. The fire answers with a crackle. A dog sleeping near the hearth lifts its head briefly before deciding nothing important is happening and immediately falls asleep again. A wise assessment. Nearby, several children begin nodding off despite determined efforts to stay awake. Full stomachs and warm fires create powerful forces. One little boy loses his battle against sleep halfway through a conversation about fishing. His audience notices. His audience is amused. The longhouse glows softly beneath the firelight while shadows dance on smoke-darkened beams overhead. Outside remains cold. Inside remains warm. This contrast defines winter life. Not luxury, not abundance, simply shelter, food, family, enough. A woman adds another log to the fire. Sparks rise briefly toward the rafters before fading. The warmth spreads once more through the room. People pull blankets tighter around their shoulders. Conversations become softer, slower. The night deepens. The village beyond the walls has grown almost completely silent beneath the snow. Only the wind continues moving across the frozen landscape. Yet inside the longhouse, life continues quietly around the hearth. A shared meal, shared stories, shared survival. And deep within the comforting glow of the Viking household, while families gather around the fire after a hearty winter supper and snowstorms sweep across the dark Scandinavian countryside beyond the walls, the simple tradition of eating together transforms another cold northern night into something warm, human, and unforgettable. Part 10. The warmth of the longhouse settles deeper as the evening grows older. Most of the meal has been eaten. The stew pots now rest beside the hearth, still warm but no longer bubbling. Wooden bowls sit stacked near the cooking area, while the smell of smoke, bread, and cooked vegetables lingers pleasantly in the air. Outside, the storm continues its patient work across the frozen landscape. Inside, another treasured part of Viking winter life is about to appear. Something saved for special moments, something sweet. Honey. More specifically, mead. Honestly, human history has repeatedly looked at honey and concluded, what if we made this more interesting? The Vikings were no exception. Near one end of the longhouse, a large wooden barrel rests beneath a hanging lamp. It has been carefully protected throughout the winter, not because it contains food, because it contains celebration. A middle-aged woman removes the wooden stopper and immediately a sweet aroma drifts into the room. Honey, fruit, fermentation, the unmistakable scent of mead. Mead, a fermented honey drink, appears throughout Viking-age Scandinavia and becomes closely associated with feasts, celebrations, hospitality, and storytelling. While everyday consumption likely varies depending on wealth and local resources, mead occupies an important place in Norse culture and mythology. After all, even the gods seem fond of it. Small wooden cups begin circulating around the room. Nothing excessive. This is not a rowdy feast hall filled with warriors boasting about impossible adventures. This is a winter evening among family. The mood remains calm, gentle, warm. A grandfather accepts his cup with visible appreciation. A younger man takes a sip and nods approvingly. The mead is good, very good. Years of experience have gone into its preparation. Honey itself remains valuable. Beekeeping exists throughout parts of Europe, and imported honey can also find its way into Norse trade networks. Turning that honey into mead requires patience, a recurring Viking theme. Patience preserves food. Patience brews drink. Patience survives winter. One elderly woman quietly recalls a wedding feast many winters ago where enough mead flowed through the hall to convince several guests they could sing. Apparently, history suggests otherwise. The room laughs softly. A safe distance in time improves many memories. Nearby a wooden plate appears something even more exciting than mead. Honey cakes. Small, simple, rare. The children notice immediately. Of course they do. Honey remains precious enough that sweet foods often become treats rather than daily staples. Which means tonight feels special, even if nobody says so directly. A young girl carefully accepts a honey cake and examines it as though it were a priceless treasure. In fairness, during a Scandinavian winter, it almost is. The Vikings may not enjoy the endless dessert options available in modern grocery stores, but they understand the power of occasional sweetness. One bite can brighten an evening. One small treat can transform an ordinary meal into a memory. Historians are still debating how widespread honey production becomes across different Viking regions and how frequently ordinary households enjoy sweet foods. But archaeological evidence suggests honey and mead remain important enough to appear repeatedly in Norse culture, poetry, and mythology. The famous mead of poetry alone receives an entire mythological backstory. The Norse clearly take their honey seriously. The fire burns warmly while mead cups pass between family members. Outside, snow continues falling. Inside, stories begin flowing more easily. Not louder, not wilder, simply warmer. A fisherman remembers a summer voyage. A farmer recalls an unusually abundant harvest. A grandmother describes a winter storm so severe that snow completely buried several outbuildings. The younger listeners stare wide-eyed. The older listeners exchange knowing smiles. Perhaps the story has grown slightly larger over the years, a natural process. The mead glows amber in the firelight. The honey cakes slowly disappear. Children grow sleepier. Adults grow more reflective. The longhouse feels wrapped in comfort now. Not luxury, not abundance, just enough sweetness to soften the hardest season of the year. The storm continues outside. The fire continues inside. And deep within the warm timber shelter of the Viking longhouse, while cups of golden mead pass gently between family members gathered around the hearth, and honey sweetens another long winter evening beneath the snow-covered Scandinavian sky, the simple pleasures of warmth, memory, and shared company continue, making the darkness easier to bear. Nobber, Part 11. The honey cakes have nearly disappeared. Only a few crumbs remain on the wooden platter resting beside the hearth. The mead barrel has been sealed once more, preserving what remains for future gatherings, future celebrations, and future winters yet to come. The fire continues, glowing warmly through the center of the longhouse. Outside, the snowstorm shows little sign of slowing. Inside, however, another cherished part of the evening is just beginning. The stories. Honestly, before television, radio, podcasts, books, and social media, people somehow survived by sitting together and talking. Remarkably, it worked for thousands of years. The children gather closer to the hearth, blankets wrapped around shoulders, eyes reflecting the firelight. Several adults settle more comfortably onto benches, already knowing what comes next. Winter storytelling, one of the oldest forms of entertainment in human history. A grandfather clears his throat dramatically. The room immediately grows quieter. Everyone recognizes the signal. A story is coming. And not just any story, a Viking story, which means there is approximately a 70% chance someone will challenge a giant, a dragon, or common sense itself. The old man smiles and begins. His voice is calm, steady, well practiced. He tells of Odin, the Allfather, wandering the world disguised as an old traveler with a wide-brimmed hat and a cloak hiding his true identity. The children listen intently. Even the adults seem drawn in. The stories are familiar, but familiarity never weakens them. If anything, it strengthens them. These tales have been told beside countless fires before this one, across generations, across centuries. Historians are still debating exactly how Norse myths evolved through oral tradition before eventually being written down in sources like the Poetic Edda and Prose Edda centuries later. But one thing remains clear. Stories live because people tell them, and winter gives them time. The grandfather continues. Odin travels through snow-covered lands testing the wisdom and generosity of ordinary people. Some welcome him, some ignore him. The consequences vary dramatically, as Norse mythology often enjoys doing. Nearby, a young boy already knows part of the story and quietly mouths several lines ahead of the storyteller. The adults pretend not to notice. A common family tradition throughout history. The fire crackles softly. Snow taps against the roof. The story unfolds. Soon another voice joins in. This time, an older woman begins recounting tales of Thor, not the polished heroic version, the traditional one, the Thor who fights giants, breaks things, eats enormous meals, and occasionally solves problems with the subtlety of a falling tree. The children adore him, naturally. One little girl asks whether Thor truly ate an entire ox in a single sitting. The adults exchange amused glances. The answer appears to be somewhere between mythology and optimism. The discussion briefly turns into an argument about exactly how much food Thor could consume, a surprisingly passionate debate. Given the evening's subject matter, perhaps not surprising at all. After all, food occupies an important place in Norse stories too. The gods feast, the heroes feast, the giants feast. Everyone seems remarkably committed to eating, a cultural detail the Vikings clearly appreciated. The storytelling continues. Now tales of great voyages emerge. Ships crossing rough seas, explorers reaching distant shores, traders returning with strange goods from lands beyond the horizon. Some stories are myths, some are memories, some have become impossible to separate. The younger listeners do not particularly care. Good stories matter more than perfect accuracy. The storm outside grows stronger. The wind howls around the longhouse. Yet inside the world feels small and bright. The firelight dances across the timber walls. Voices rise and fall. Children drift closer to sleep. The stories become softer, slower. A grandmother begins describing ancient winter spirits said to wander through forests during snowstorms. Several children immediately pull blankets closer. Mission accomplished. Every storyteller understands their audience. The mead cups sit mostly forgotten now. The food has been eaten. The work of the day is done. Only the stories remain, passing knowledge, passing culture, passing time itself. And deep within the warm shelter of the Viking longhouse, while tales of Odin, Thor, distant voyages, and ancient mysteries drift through the firelit room, and winter storms roam across the frozen Scandinavian night beyond the walls, the timeless tradition of storytelling continues, weaving memory, wisdom, and wonder into another long northern evening. Part 12. The stories drift more slowly now. The younger children have begun losing their battle against sleep, one by one. A small boy rests against his father's shoulder. A girl who swore she would stay awake for every story has quietly fallen asleep beneath a wool blanket near the hearth. The adults notice. The adults smile. No one wakes them. Outside, the storm continues its endless conversation with the winter sky. Inside, the longhouse glows with warmth and memory. Honestly, there may be no force in human history more powerful than a full stomach, a warm fire, and a long story after dark. The storyteller pauses to take a sip of water. The room settles into comfortable silence. For a few moments, only the crackling fire can be heard. Then an older farmer speaks, not about gods, not about heroes, but about something far more important to winter survival. Bad harvests. The mood changes slightly. Not gloomy, thoughtful. Every Viking family understands that winter is generous only when preparation succeeds, and preparation does not always succeed. Some years bring storms, some years bring drought, some years bring disease among livestock. Nature does not negotiate. A woman near the hearth quietly recalls a winter from her childhood when early frosts damaged much of the barley harvest. The grain stores never became completely empty, but they became frighteningly low before spring arrived. The children who remain awake listen carefully. These stories matter, not because they are entertaining, because they are lessons. Historians are still debating exactly how often severe food shortages occurred in different Viking regions, but archaeological evidence suggests that survival could become extremely difficult during years of poor harvests or prolonged weather disasters. Preparation reduced risk. It never eliminated risk. One elderly fisherman nods slowly. He remembers a year when storms prevented boats from leaving harbor for weeks. The preserved fish stores suddenly became far more valuable than anyone had expected. Fortunately, the village had prepared well. Fortunately matters a great deal in history. The conversation turns toward emergency foods, foods people hope not to rely upon, but keep available anyway. Additional dried fish, extra grain reserves, stored dairy products, wild foods gathered during autumn. Even tree bark occasionally appears in historical accounts from northern regions during periods of severe hardship. Not because anyone enjoys eating tree bark, because survival sometimes requires creativity. A young boy asks whether tree bark tastes good. The adults share a look. The answer arrives carefully. No. The boy appears satisfied with this information. The room laughs softly. The tension eases. A grandmother reaches into a small wooden container and removes a handful of dried berries gathered during summer. Tiny treasures, lingonberries, bilberries, wild fruits carefully preserved for winter. The berries are passed around slowly. Each person receives only a few. Yet somehow that makes them more special. Sweetness becomes memorable when it is rare. One elderly woman explains how gathering berries often becomes a family activity during late summer. Children help. Grandparents help. Everyone participates because everyone understands that winter is already coming, even while the sun still shines. That awareness shapes life in the north. The Vikings rarely separate seasons completely. Summer is always preparing for winter. Winter is always waiting for summer. The cycle never stops. Outside, the storm begins calming slightly. The wind remains strong, but its angry howling softens into something gentler. The snow continues falling. Steady now. Almost peaceful. Inside, people move closer to the fire, not because they are cold, because the night feels comfortable here. Safe. Sheltered. A young woman begins mending a wool cloak while listening. An older man carves a replacement handle for a wooden tool. Hands remain busy. Winter evenings rarely belong to idleness. Even rest serves a purpose. The remaining dried berries disappear. The stories continue. The fire glows warmly beneath the smoke-darkened beams overhead, and deep within the sheltering timber walls of the Viking longhouse, while families share memories of difficult winters, careful preparations, and the foods that carried them through hard years, and gentle snow drifts across the sleeping Scandinavian landscape beyond the walls, the quiet wisdom of survival continues passing from one generation to the next. Part 13. The snow falls more gently now. The fierce wind that battered the longhouse earlier has finally begun to tire itself out, leaving only soft gusts drifting across the frozen fields and dark forests beyond the village. Inside, the fire still burns brightly. The warmth reaches every corner of the room. Children sleep beneath wool blankets. Adults speak more quietly. The night has entered its peaceful middle hours. And now conversation turns towards something everyone looks forward to during the darkest part of winter. The great midwinter celebrations, the feasts, the gatherings, the season later known as Yule. Honestly, if you've spent months eating preserved fish and carefully rationed turnips, any excuse for a feast starts sounding like an excellent religious tradition. An older woman smiles as she recalls a Yule feast from many winters ago. The memory seems bright even now. Long tables, roasting meats, fresh bread, barrels of ale and mead, neighbors arriving through the snow carrying gifts and stories. For a few precious days, winter feels less threatening, more festive. The Vikings celebrate during the darkest season not because winter is easy, because winter is difficult. People need reasons to gather, reasons to laugh, reasons to remember that spring will eventually return. Historians are still debating the precise details of Yule celebrations across different regions of Scandinavia, but evidence strongly suggests that winter feasting plays an important role throughout Norse society. Food becomes more than nourishment, it becomes community. One fisherman recalls helping prepare a Yule feast in his youth. Several pigs had been slaughtered, large cuts of meat smoked and roasted, special breads baked from carefully reserved grain. Even foods normally saved for emergencies appeared on the tables. For a few days, abundance replaced caution, not recklessness, just celebration. A grandmother nearby nods in agreement. Certain foods are deliberately set aside for these occasions. The finest cheese, the best preserved meats, the sweetest honey. Winter teaches thrift, festivals reward patience. Near the hearth, one young boy wakes briefly and overhears part of the conversation. The mention of feast food immediately captures his attention. The mention of work required to prepare it does not. A very human response. The adults laugh softly. The boy falls asleep again before learning any useful details. Outside, the snow settles across rooftops and fences beneath a sky crowded with stars. The storm has nearly passed. The village rests quietly beneath the winter night. Inside the longhouse, memories of celebrations continue flowing. One woman remembers musicians playing near the fire while children dance between benches. Another recalls contests of storytelling that lasted nearly until dawn. A farmer remembers enough food on the table to satisfy even the most ambitious appetites in the village. That last memory receives considerable attention. Food remains a serious subject. A wooden cup passes slowly from hand to hand. Not much mead remains. Enough for conversation. Enough for memory. Not enough for trouble. The best balance, perhaps. One elderly man begins describing the Yule boar, an important symbol in many Norse traditions. The younger listeners lean closer, partly because of the story, partly because it involves food. The combination proves irresistible. The firelight flickers across the timber walls while the storyteller speaks of feasts, oaths, family gatherings, and hopes carried into the coming year. Winter celebrations are not merely about surviving the cold. They are about imagining life beyond it. The promise that darkness will not last forever. The promise that fields will grow green again. The promise that food stores will one day be replenished. Outside, the snow-covered landscape sleeps beneath moonlight. Inside, people remember brighter days while preparing for brighter days still to come. A few remaining honeycrumbs are discovered on a wooden plate and immediately become the subject of intense negotiation among younger family members. History repeats itself beautifully. The conversation drifts onward. The fire glows warmly. The longhouse settles deeper into comfort, and deep within the sheltering heart of the Viking home, while stories of Yule feasts, roasted meats, honey cakes, and joyous midwinter gatherings warm the spirits of families gathered around the hearth, and fresh snow sparkles beneath the stars across the sleeping Scandinavian countryside beyond the walls. The hope of celebration continues, shining brightly through the longest nights of winter. Part 14. The memories of Yule linger warmly around the longhouse. For a little while, everyone seems transported beyond the present winter night, beyond the snow, beyond the darkness, back toward crowded feast tables glowing with candlelight and laughter. But eventually the stories settle. The room grows quieter again. The fire remains, the warmth remains, and outside the storm has finally surrendered. The world beyond the walls lies silent beneath fresh snow. Honestly, few sights are more peaceful than a village after a winter storm. Everything becomes softer, quieter, as though the entire landscape has decided to sleep. A young woman rises carefully and pulls aside a small wooden shutter covering one of the longhouse openings. Moonlight spills inside immediately, silver and cold. Several people glance toward the opening. The view is beautiful. The village roofs wear thick blankets of snow. Fence posts emerge from white drifts like tiny islands. Beyond them, the dark forest stands motionless beneath the stars. Even the fjord reflects pale moonlight where ice has formed along the shoreline. The storm has polished the world. Inside, however, life continues at a gentler pace. Several adults begin preparing sleeping areas near the warmest parts of the longhouse. Fur blankets are unfolded. Wool bedding is arranged. Children already asleep are carefully moved without waking. A remarkable parental skill practiced across every civilization. The fire crackles softly. A log settles deeper into the embers. Tiny sparks rise briefly toward the rafters before disappearing. Historians are still debating exactly how sleeping arrangements varied between different Viking households, but archaeological evidence suggests that longhouses often function as shared living spaces where families, workers, and sometimes even livestock occupied different sections of the same structure. Privacy, by modern standards, was somewhat limited. Warmth, however, was abundant, and during winter, warmth wins. An elderly shepherd stretches slowly and settles onto a bench near the hearth. His work is finished for the day. The animals have been checked. The food stores remain secure. Tomorrow can wait until morning. One by one, conversations begin fading. A fisherman finishes repairing his net. A woman sets aside her spinning. A farmer places tools back into their proper places along the wall. The evening's work concludes. Only rest remains. A young boy briefly wakes and asks whether breakfast will include bread. The adults assure him that bread will, in fact, continue existing tomorrow. Satisfied, he immediately falls asleep again. A practical child. Near the hearth, the grandmother who spoke earlier about difficult winters now quietly tells one final story. Not a saga, not a myth, just a memory. She remembers sitting beside a similar fire as a young girl during another snowy winter night many decades ago. The same warmth, the same smell of bread and smoke, the same sound of wind beyond the walls. Generations pass, the seasons repeat, yet certain moments remain remarkably unchanged. The younger listeners fall silent. Perhaps they understand, perhaps they simply feel sleepy. Either way, the room grows peaceful. Outside, moonlight glitters across untouched snow. The storm clouds have moved on. The stars shine brightly above Scandinavia. Cold dominates the landscape. But not this house. Not tonight. Inside, preparation has done its work. The grain stores remain filled. The vegetables remain protected. The fish and meat remain preserved. The dairy survives another winter week. The family remains fed, safe, together. The greatest victory most people in history ever truly sought. The fire burns lower. The shadows deepen. Sleep settles gently across the longhouse. And deep within the warm timber shelter of the Viking home, while moonlight shines across fresh snow outside, and generations rest peacefully beside the hearth after an evening of food, stories, and quiet companionship, another long northern winter night drifts softly toward its end. Part 15. The night grows very still. Only the fire remains awake. Its embers glow softly in the center of the longhouse, casting warm orange light across sleeping blankets, wooden benches, and smoke-darkened beams overhead. The conversations have ended. The stories have been told. The bowls have been cleared. Even the dog beside the hearth has surrendered completely to sleep. Outside, winter holds the land in silence. Fresh snow covers every path, every fence, every rooftop in the village. The storm that raged through the evening has disappeared beyond the horizon, leaving behind a world transformed into silver and white beneath the stars. Honestly, the Vikings spent much of their lives battling difficult weather, dangerous seas, and uncertain harvests. But at moments like this, the North rewards patience with extraordinary beauty. The moon hangs above the fjord. Its pale light reflects across the ice forming near the shoreline. Beyond the village, dark forests stretch toward distant mountains where snow gleams faintly beneath the night sky. Everything appears calm, timeless, as though the entire landscape has paused to rest. Inside the longhouse, families sleep beneath wool and fur. The warmth from the hearth still lingers in the timber walls. The smell of bread, smoke, and cooked stew remains faintly in the air. Tomorrow, life will begin again. Someone will wake before dawn. The fire will be fed. Fresh bread may be baked. Animals will need care. Snow will need clearing. Work will return. The cycle always continues, but not yet. For now, there is only peace. Historians are still debating many details of daily Viking life, what meals varied between regions, how households organized their winters, which traditions differed from village to village. Yet one thing remains wonderfully clear. Most Vikings were not spending every day raiding distant shores. Most were doing what people everywhere have always done: preparing food, protecting family, sharing stories, surviving winter, finding moments of comfort whenever they could. The longhouse settles deeper into silence. A log shifts gently within the embers. Tiny sparks rise briefly before fading. One child turns over beneath a blanket and sighs softly in sleep. The sound barely disturbs the room. Outside, a fox crosses the snow-covered edge of the village, leaving delicate tracks beneath the moonlight. No one sees it. No one needs to. The night belongs to itself. The stored grain waits patiently for future meals. The dried fish hangs safely in storage. The smoked meat remains preserved above the hearth. The cheese wheels rest in their cool containers. The root vegetables sleep beneath straw and timber. Months of preparation quietly protecting the future. A lesson repeated through generations. Summer feeds winter. Patience feeds survival. Community feeds hope. The stars drift slowly westward above Scandinavia. Far away, beyond mountains and forests, the first faint signs of dawn begin gathering beyond the horizon. Still distant, still hidden, but coming, always coming. The long winter night cannot last forever. No winter ever does. And deep within the warm shelter of the Viking longhouse, while families rest peacefully after an evening of bread, fish, stew, cheese, honey, stories, and shared companionship, and moonlight glows softly across the snow-covered Scandinavian landscape beyond the walls, another winter night passes safely into memory. The fire continues glowing. The village continues sleeping. And somewhere beyond the frozen horizon, a new day slowly prepares to rise over the north. End of script. Sweet dreams.